Hey minions, welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and on this episode of Calling All Titans, I'll be talking about the big funny giant, the new Trickster Titan, which I'll shorten to BFG. I often ask people what their favorite faction is, and as you might expect, zombies and robots get picked a lot. But the Tricksters are in the top 3, which is surprising because in my opinion, they simply aren't that good. Getting a Titan seems to be evidence of that, and I guess players just really enjoy irritating one another. I'll consider playing them if I get the right partner, but generally I don't like them and I consider them to be the weakest of the core set. Nevertheless, my friends really like them, so what does that mean? It's time for me to get nicer friends. Before we take a look at this Titan, let's take a quick look at why the Tricksters need a Titan. I really like the Leprechaun as an area control minion, and players are disinclined to want to target Brownie. But I have issues with Gnome as well as Gremlin. If Gnome could destroy minions of equal power, this would be a much better card. The Gremlin's destruction will grant you a card while making everyone else discard one. That's nice, but you still lose your minion. Combine this with the fact that the Gnome's ability makes you have to pile onto a base to kill your Gremlin, and they become very inconvenient. If you are bent on destroying your Gremlins, you are essentially playing 4 minions down with no power to compensate, unlike the Sprouts or the Killer Plants who have the same problem. They replace themselves. I believe this creates a lack of power for the Tricksters rather than a direct lack of power. For example, you could win with 30 power per faction, even with less than that, if you have the right cards, but it's hard to do it when you're down minions. So my 2 biggest issues are with the minions they have and the power shortage those minions create, and I mentioned in my Disenchant video that having 2 copies of that card is unnecessary, but there is one more problem with the Tricksters. In my opinion, their best asset is their area control, and they simply don't have enough of that. BFG solves that problem while helping with a few of the others. Unfortunately, this Titan also has a few weaknesses. Fittingly, the Tricksters, an unconventional faction, have a Titan that requires an unconventional strategy. In order to play BFG, you must play it on a base where no players have a minion, not even yourself. Unless your opponents are deliberately trying to prevent you from doing this, it should not be too hard. You have to give up your regular minion play, which is okay and something you should do on your first turn. There are always more bases than players, so even if you went last, it's highly likely that there is an open base. You will get +1 counter on the BFG because of his ongoing ability, which has 2 parts. For each turn that you end on a base with no other player's minions, which should be the first turn it's played, the BFG gets 1 power counter. Why wouldn't opponents play minions on that base? Because BFG acts like Pay the Piper, but in mobile fashion. Note that BFG makes you discard the card before you play the minion, which actually makes it better than Pay the Piper. The last ability of the BFG is to destroy a minion of power 2 or less to move it to another base. The BFG becomes a more effective measure to turn your Gremlins into cannon fodder rather than the Gnomes. You can play a Gremlin, immediately destroying it to activate its ability while moving the BFG and all of its power counters to another base. Tying the successful destruction to the movement is necessary because of Cave of Shinies. I still maintain that the Gremlins need as many rewards as possible to merit destruction, but leaving BFG on that base would have been unfair. If you are committed to destroying your Gremlins, at least you don't need your Gnomes to do it, mitigating their problem I mentioned earlier. Depending on your partner faction, the power counter boost may or may not be a lost cause. Particularly in higher player counts, it's easy to get an opponent minion on every base. Discarding 1 card to play a minion to nullify the BFG's growth is an easy sacrifice. The Tricksters still have difficulty destroying minions because of Gnome's weaknesses, so once at least one opponent gets a minion on the base, it may be hard to get them off of it. It only takes 1 minion, and you have up to 3 players to contend with. The BFG also does not block movement. Therefore, if you can combine the BFG with talent-based movement or destruction, you may be able to generate a power counter per turn. One of my first thoughts was to play the Leprechaun with the BFG, but I wouldn't recommend that. While you would exclude all but king minions, it seems to be a waste of his ongoing ability. Instead, I would consider the unconventional strategy of ignoring the power counters altogether and focusing on area control. As I mentioned earlier, the BFG is another pay the piper. In a 4-player game, you will generally have 5 bases, although it's possible to have more. Play the Leprechaun on one, the BFG on another, pay the piper on a third, block the path on a fourth, and you might have successfully funneled all minions onto the 5th base. This might be a base that is either a ninja base or one with a small distribution of points between first and second. With less players and therefore less bases, you can even double up. BFG and pay the piper make it an exorbitant price to play a minion there, having to discard 2 cards. You have literally created a pick your poison scenario that will infuriate your opponents. With this Titan, I would strongly recommend pairing Tricksters with Dragons if you do not value your friendships. Given that the Dragons have Great Worm and 2 copies of Runes, as well as dangerous grounds that will provide further discarding, you can wall off a base for yourself unless an opponent has a heavy dose of action destruction. But because BFG is a Titan, that ability will be unaffected. So how do we deal with Titans? Of course, a clash of the Titans. Given how difficult it is to accrue power counters on BFG, and the fact that you lose your regular minion play when you play it, expect to have only 1 power on a base your first turn. It's actually possible to lose a Clash of Titans on turn 2 and be back to square one. The longer the game goes on, the harder it will be to get BFG back out. This is something you will just have to anticipate, since there's not a whole lot you can do about it other than increasing power on the base that it is. The alternative is to not play the BFG until later, thereby not losing your minion play, but you may have lost your opportunity by that point. Susceptibility to the Clash of Titans is definitely the BFG's first weakness, but not the only one. If they weren't already a tremendous Trickster counter before, the Kaiju also benefit from being unaffected by the BFG since they have primarily actions. You can play 2 actions on a base to gain power, then play Gorgonzola with your minion play to clash with the BFG. The Kaiju are already immune to block the path, which only targets minions, similar to such actions as Pay the Piper and Flame Trap, as well as the Leprechaun. You can argue that the Kaiju actually make it easier to play BFG because they don't put minions on bases, plus the fact that the Tricksters have 2 Disenchants, but make no mistake, the Kaiju own the Tricksters, and BFG is no exception to their wrath. There are a lot of abilities to consider with the BFG: gaining power counters, forceful discarding, destroying low power minions, a mobile Titan, etc., but I believe it is best to focus on the area control. Opponents would not likely play power 2 minions on that same base, knowing that you can just destroy them. And to target those on a different base requires 2 turns and a sacrificial Gremlin, since you must move BFG there to destroy that next minion next turn. A good power negation faction might help with this, but de-emphasizing the movement and focusing on area control can make multiple bases undesirable for your opponents, and that is what the Tricksters do best. The Tricksters lack that 1 extra card that they needed in higher player counts, and now they have it in BFG. When I do play Tricksters, I enjoy creating a variety of bases where anything my opponents do ends badly for them. The BFG makes this that much easier, and it will give the Tricksters the boost they need. The power helps, but may not be around for very often. Instead, use the BFG to guide players to where they don't want to be, and don't be worried about maximizing all of this Titan's ability. Sometimes simpler is better. With so many abilities, you're bound to use the BFG differently. How do you use it? Let me know in the comments. That's it for this week. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.